Morning. I always appreciate the politeness in Europe where people clap before the presentation. My American counterparts tend to wait until you've delivered something of value and then maybe they clap, but appreciate it nonetheless. By way of introduction, my name is Johan Hanekom, and like you, I'm very passionate about sustainability and innovation. I've had the privilege of working in this space for the past 25 years. I actually had my own business that I scaled as a startup, and we sold it eventually. And then I worked in private equity for about 10 years. So looking at businesses that had more potential that they could unlock and looking at how we work with those management teams to scale their operations. And one of those businesses we actually decided not to invest in. It was a little startup in Silicon Valley, in a garage of all places. And I decided to leave this very high-flying position that I had in the organization to join this startup. And everyone thought I was crazy because why would you risk a very stable career to go back to the basics and help build a business? But my gut feeling proved to be right because 6 months later, we were actually acquired by Enel. So they're an Italian utility, and it was part of their twin transformation towards becoming a technology-driven company. So $1 billion was allocated, 70 companies were bought. We were a very small percentage of that $1 billion acquisition. But it gave me this opportunity to then be amalgamated and integrated into a large corporate to see what are the challenges when you have to scale that innovation, taking into account large organizations can be quite complex to work in, whereas startups are a bit more agile. There are less rules that one has to play by, so to speak. And that journey took me to Amazon, where I was the sustainability leader and also led innovation for EMEA. And part of our transformational organization was actually to look at how can we help our customers achieve their net zero strategies through the lens of technology and innovation. So what technologies and what innovation do they need to apply in order to reach their net zero targets? Because fundamentally, because of scope 3, it all ties back to Amazon's net zero targets as well. So that brought me to think about a topic where we could take all of these concepts, kind of weave them together. And I've named it Garage Thinking because it very much encapsulates this entrepreneurial spirit, which we should all be having in our businesses in order to continue thriving and at the very least surviving in a world that is changing at an ever-increasing pace. And I know we have this fascination with the Magnificent Seven. So these are the 7 big tech companies that are out there. We used to call them FANG. So it used to be Facebook, Amazon, Apple, Netflix, and Google. And then over the last 5 years, that ranking order has shifted a little bit. So even the likes of Netflix, that's a very successful company and very admirable, they've kind of fallen by the wayside. So it's just a very valuable lesson that this list isn't static. It's a dynamic list. And if you want to be included in it, you've got to stay agile, you've got to keep growing, you've got to stay customer obsessed. 3 things that I want to reveal today in this presentation is firstly, the importance of a culture of innovation. So as you're listening to the presentation, think about your role in your organization and whether there is a culture of innovation. Secondly, we were talking about the importance of mechanisms. So how do you surface ideas in your business? How do you identify the right ones? Also, very importantly, how do you kill off ideas that are no longer relevant, right? And thirdly, we'll be looking at how to structure teams. So organizing individuals is highly complex. I personally find it hard to organize myself. So imagine having to organize others if you can barely manage yourself, right? And we have the situation where often in management roles, people are great individual contributors, and that's why they become managers. And so today's discussion will also be about what does it take to be a product manager, team management, the HR challenges that come with that. And at the end of it, how you bring this all together, the fast start that you need, right? So outside of this presentation, what can you take away from it and start applying straight away? I want to start off with a quick story around a company that I'm very close to and very impressed by, which is Apple. Apple's founding story is quite impressive. So does anyone know who this person is, the man in the photo, holding his finger to his head? Does anyone, any wild guesses? All right, 1 or 2 hands. So you're looking at a person that had they held onto their stocks in Apple would have been the richest person in the world. richer than Elon Musk, right? He, at one stage, had 10% of Apple's equity, right? Apple's worth about $3.5 trillion. 10% of that is $350 million. Not that money is a measure of success, but in the ranking orders, it makes him wealthier than Elon Musk right now. And he sold his shares 2 weeks after founding Apple. So he was 41 at the time. He met this guy called Steve Jobs at work when they were both at Atari. And Steve had this idea to build computers. And Ronald was very good at writing documents. And he came up with the Apple logo. And over a lunch break, the two of them decided, let's start a business because we've got a logo and you can write manuals. This is a great idea. And Steve said, well, I've got another friend at work who's also Steve Wozniak. He's a technically brilliant individual. The three of us should really start something. And so Steve at the time, Steve Jobs was 21, Steve Wozniak was 25, and then, really Ronald's role was to be the cool head, the 41-year-old. I'm 40, so I can understand where sometimes you have this balance of young dynamism with a bit more of a tempered attitude. But Ronald had some failures along life's journey. One of them was a slot machine business that nearly bankrupted him. So very risk-averse individual, which is why 12 days after founding Apple, he said to the two Steves, look, I'm pulling out of this. I've had some second thoughts. I'm happy to share my 10% equity in the business for $800. And so they bought back his equity. There are interviews where Ronald is asked, do you regret your decision? Of course, he's like, well, it would have been great to have held on to some of that equity, even 1%. But you make a judgment call based on what you know at the time. The harsh reality for Ronald is really that he's really good at picking winners, but terrible at converting them because in the late 2000s, he sold the partnership agreement between him and the Steves for $500. And about 5 years later, that was sold for $1.6 million. So he's exceptional identifying opportunities, but just lets them slip through his fingers. What's significant about this story is that, Apple started in a garage. Amazon started in a garage. Google started in a garage. You can run through the list of all of these great companies that had very, very humble beginnings. And garage thinking is about using what you have with the time you have and just getting going. Oftentimes, especially in the VC world and the private equity world, I work with founders where they want to have everything at their disposal straight away. They're asking for millions, tens of millions, hundreds of millions of funding to start their great idea. And the harsh reality is that you have to start with what you have, right? Frugality, optimizing your resources and then scaling what you have. And so it comes to a point where you've got to look at how do I codify my culture of innovation? So in the beginning, it's obviously easy because the founders are together. There's a lot of dynamism. There's a lot of opportunity and enthusiasm. But as the business grows and as the ability of the founders to influence the rest of the company, how do they codify that so that there is a standard operating procedure around which you can galvanize the culture of innovation? I think it's poignant as well that we remind ourselves that just having a culture of innovation in and of itself isn't good enough. And we heard earlier about being customer obsessed, right? Customers are moving targets, needs shift, want shift. And there is a bit of a dichotomy in the market around, do you listen to what the customers want and then create it? That's kind of the Amazon philosophy, working backwards from customer needs. Or do you assume that customers don't know what they want and therefore you create something and then show it to them, which is the Apple philosophy? So two great companies with two very conflicting strategies. But if we look at this list of some of these brands, these were once very innovative companies. And for some of you, these brands may be familiar. Some of these products you may not be familiar with anymore, given your age. But you look at the VHS tape, right? So VHS tape, this is what we used to have before we had Netflix. So, and this particular company is called Blockbuster. Blockbuster was a very famous household name where you would go on a Friday night and fight for the latest release of a movie that just came out. And they had this policy where if you didn't rewind the tape, you'd have to pay a penalty, right? So there was kind of reinforcing positive social behavior. But Blockbuster's story is interesting because Blockbuster had the opportunity to buy Netflix. So Reed Hastings and his business partner went to Blockbuster and said, "You're currently supplying your customers with VHS tapes online and DVDs eventually. We are looking at doing this as well, and we'd love to be your partner. Why don't you buy us?" And Blockbuster said, "Look, we have zero interest in buying you because, quite frankly, your business model looks so erratic and the revenue streams are very questionable. We're going to take a pass on this." And obviously, that was a big pass that they took. And eventually, Blockbuster went bankrupt in 2010 because they stuck to their bricks and mortar strategy, refusing to accept that the market was moving to online streaming. And even Netflix had to pivot from physical DVDs. I remember when I lived in New York in 2008, you would get this DVD through the mail, you'd watch it, and then you'd post it back. And they eventually had to evolve as well to say that's a bit of a clunky business model. Let's remove the friction and just stream online. Kodak is an incredible story where Steven Sasson actually invented the digital camera in 1975. So he was a young graduate hire from Kodak, and they didn't know what to do with him. So they said, "Look, Steven, why don't you join our innovation team, do some research on a topic that you're interested in, and come back to us in a year or two with your results." So he was given blank space, followed the mandate, figured out a way for light to be converted to a digital form onto a tape so you could play it through a television set, and presented this idea to the board. And they were horrified by it because it was going to cannibalize their core business, which is film, right? And Kodak was a very successful company, which was their downfall because it was so hard to convince management that it was time to move away from that which was successful. And in order to do that, it might require the cannibalization of their core business. And the core business wasn't actually film, it was photography, right? A subtle difference. But they fell in love with their solutions, and they fell in love with the product versus the service that they were offering customers. Another little factoid about Kodak, they were actually one of the first companies in the world to have an image sharing website, similar to Instagram, back in 2001. And it was a very successful website, other than it was not very social, right? It was great if you shared a photo, you could print it pretty quickly. It was a nice way to get access to other people's photos, get permission from them to print it as well. But they failed to pivot towards the social aspect of the photo sharing. And that's where Instagram was able to do it really, really well. Nokia, who doesn't know who Nokia is or what a Nokia 5110 is and the fact that it's indestructible, right? You can probably switch it on today and it'll still have battery power from 10 years ago. Incredible household name. Nokia at one stage had 50% market share of all handheld devices. That's incredible. The challenge with Nokia was that they had exceptional hardware, but really poor user interface. And later, it was also revealed that the management was not really customer-centric. So Nokia fell in love with hardware, they fell in love with the technical mastery of the product, but they failed to pivot towards touchscreens, software and apps, and user interface, which is where the market was moving. And even though Microsoft acquired Nokia, even Microsoft couldn't extract value from Nokia. 2 years later, they wrote it off as a tax deductible, right? You still get Nokias, they still do collaborations with other products, but they're nowhere near the power base that they had before. MySpace, first mover in the social media sector. Facebook came out a year after MySpace. And the challenge with MySpace is that they wanted to monetize their user base too quickly. Again, like Kodak with the image sharing, failed to appreciate that socializing on the internet was going to become a thing, right? It wasn't just a transactional mechanism, it was actually a way to connect with others. And last but not least, Yahoo. So back in the early 2000s, Yahoo had the opportunity to buy Google for $1 million, right? Google went to Yahoo and said, "Why don't you buy us? We're running out of funds. We'd love to work with you versus compete with you." And Yahoo kind of laughed at them and said, "Look, your business model makes absolutely no sense." And 10 years later, the narrative is very different. They actually had a second opportunity to buy Google 5 years later for $3 billion. So that was a big uplift in price. And Google refused. They were like, "Your vision is too small for search." So the power balance shifts very quickly in today's markets, right? And the lessons, there are so many more of these companies, Palm Pilot, that we can look at. You know, the CEO of Palm Pilot very famously said in 2000, Apple one day will be selling fruit, not cell phones, right? 2008, Apple launched the iPhone, changed everything. So all of these are lessons, you know. There are other brands that will appear on this list as the years go by, right? Household brands that were once, you know, part of your daily narrative will appear on this list as trivia answers, right? That's where you don't want to end up, which is why this title reflects the sentiment, which is you're never too big to fail, right? And the strategy that got you here is not necessarily going to be the strategy that gets you where you need to be. I'm going to play a very quick video, and it's about Amazon's door desk. So, and I'll tell you a bit more about that afterwards.
I started in June of 1995. We needed a desk, and we were operating on a shoestring budget. Jeff Bezos had walked across the street, bought a door and a 4x4, and built the first door desk.
We had to find ways to get things done without spending a lot of money. So it was just more out of survival and making sure we had enough money to pay our paychecks.
Door desk is a solid core door held up by four 4x4 legs and some metal brackets to hold it together. There was only one or maybe two desks that Jeff Bezos had made, and they were pretty wobbly. You would never want to hire Jeff Bezos as a carpenter. He's much better at other things. I think he'd tell you the same thing.
In the later years, the desk really started to become a focal point of Amazon culture.
I think it's taken on a symbolic status. The philosophy of frugality at Amazon is when you have a problem, find the easiest, more straightforward, and least expensive way to solve it.
I have a couple, one in the garage, and then I took one and chopped it down and made 3 desks. 2 of them are my kids' school desks they use to do homework on. They know that this is Amazon history and part of the Amazon culture.
There you go. Have yourself a door desk.
Cool. So the door desk is one of these iconic symbols within Amazon, right? 30 years later, the word frugality, which was one of the first leadership principles for Amazon, is still readily used in the organization. So in spite of the fact that Amazon generates $1 million a minute, frugality is still a concept that is pioneered and enforced and encouraged. And the door desk, in all of our executive boardrooms, we use door desks because it reminds us of where this company started. And what they don't tell you about door desks is because of the hinges at the edges, you always knock your knees when you sit at a door desk. So you've got to be very vigilant when you move in and out. But it's kind of a rite of passage the first time you bump your knees against the door desk because it's a physical reminder of what you have in front of you. And, you know, it's a great story around a company that had a tough start, right? So Amazon started 30 years ago in 1994 in a garage in Bellevue, Washington. And Jeff at the time had left a very successful role in private equity to pursue this dream of being the world's largest online retailer of books. Quite a small vision compared to what Amazon is today, but very grand for back in 1994. And a year later, after starting Amazon, he had to go and find funding for the business because Amazon was going bankrupt. So by his own admission, he had exhausted the first round of funding, which is family, friends, and fools, and was now looking for institutional investors that were a bit more robust in their assessment of the company's profitability. And he had meetings with about 50 investors, and of those 50, 20 were willing to invest in Amazon, quite a small percentage. And he was willing to give them 10% equity in Amazon in exchange for $1 million, right? And so most of the presentation was actually about explaining to these would-be investors what the internet was. So back in 1995, it hadn't reached the parity that it has now, where most of us have internet in our hands. It's ubiquitous. We can't really see ourselves living without it. But back in 1995, it was still quite an experimental concept. You know, and we remember the 2000 bust where the internet was actually seen as, you know, it had come and gone. And the story behind that is this willingness to be misunderstood, right? To have a very big vision and to stay customer obsessed. Now, obviously, Amazon still sells books online, but it also sells a lot of other things. In fact, it has 400 million products on its website. So quite an extensive list of things that you can buy. And what underpins the culture of Amazon is very much these leadership principles. So Amazon has 16 leadership principles. And Amazon hires against the leadership principles. They promote against the leadership principles. It's used in every email, in the conversation. It's against the walls. It's very much part of the DNA of the organization. And the questions that I would always get around standardization of culture is that, does it lead to a homogeneous environment where everyone's the same? And the reality is it doesn't. But what it does give you as a customer is an expectation that you will have a certain set of behaviors and principles that you can hold someone accountable to. So bias for action is one of them, right? So bias for action, think big is another leadership principle at Amazon. And so when you bring those two together, they have conflicting values. It's very hard to think big and showcase bias for action. Deep dive is another one, right? Take time to learn about a topic so you can serve the customer better. And then we have another leadership principle called have backbone, disagree, and commit, which is a way to, if both of us have the same customer obsession, but you want to dive deep into a topic and I want to showcase bias for action, how do we resolve this in a respectful manner? So these 16 leadership principles evolve as well. They're not static. There used to be 5 and now there are 16. And they reflect the current narrative of the organization. Amazon, however, is a long-term thinker. And the view of these leadership principles is to help promote long-term thinking in the engagements that Amazonians have with their customers. Further on in terms of the organizational structure, so Amazon is very famous for its 2-pizza team model. And these are small, decentralized teams that collaborate and compete with one another internally in order to deliver results for customers. Jeff was once asked, what is your sentiment around having 2 teams working on the same solution? Surely that's duplication of resources. And he said he'd rather have 2 teams working on a business outcome than no teams at all, right? So this friendly competition internally also leads to first mover advantage around ideation. But Amazon also has spectacular failures, right? So for those of you that remember the Fire Phone, that was Amazon's foray into the mobile phone market, which at that stage was starting to become an important strategic advantage, share of mind space of the customer. So outside of the television, how else can we access your attention? And the phone is a great way to do that, as we see in today's society. So Amazon figured, let's launch a Fire Phone, and that way we have more share of equity of the customer's environment, and we have greater mind access with the customer as well. That being said, the Fire Phone turned out to be a spectacular failure. So after a year of launching it, actually within the first 3 months of launching it, the price was reduced from $199 to 99 cents, basically giving it away for free, right? Token price. And 9 months after the price reduction, the executives at Amazon decided to discontinue the product, right? To pull it from the market, wrote off $170 million worth of stock. But the real penalty was the fear of failure that could instill in the organization. And Jeff came out straight away and did a panel session with journalists. And one journalist asked him, can you talk us through the failure of the Fire Phone? What is your strategy going to be going forward? And he very politely answered and said, the Fire Phone will be small compared to some of the failures we're working on right now. So we think we're on the right path with what we're doing, but some of our biggest failures are yet to be revealed. But we carry on, we keep going, we count the wins and the losses, and provided the wins outweigh the losses, we're in a good footing. One of the leadership principles from Amazon as well is invent and simplify. And in 2006, when Amazon launched Amazon Web Services, which is the cloud computing part of Amazon, Wall Street thought it was a terrible idea, right? So in spite of Amazon's success, in spite of proving to the market that he's able to identify new market segments and with his teams develop them, there was a lot of concern around Amazon moving away from its core business. But Jeff was convinced that it was the right thing to do, continued pushing, and eventually had the willingness to be misunderstood for long periods of time. And this is another verbiage that you will hear from Amazonians. You have to be willing to be misunderstood for long periods of time, which is surprisingly hard because no one really likes to go to work every day not being understood, right? we like to be liked. So when you're willing to be misunderstood, it takes a certain personality type to be that. But thankfully, he pushed on because now AWS generates $100 billion a year in revenue. So it's kind of an important revenue stream for Amazon in the bigger scheme of things. And that's within an 18-year window. The Kindle was another example of a product that was met with a lot of resistance internally. So Jeff's CFO at the time actually kind of wanted to rally the board against him to get him fired and said, we're not going to release funds to launch the Kindle. It's going to cannibalize our book sales. And book sales at that stage was 20% of Amazon's revenue, right? So we start hearing some of the Kodak stories starting to surface within Amazon. And Jeff said, look, I'm going to carry on with this. So he fired the CFO, which is one way of removing the obstacle, and pushed forward and launched the Kindle. And ironically, it actually led to more interest in books and adoption of books and reading. It was an opportunity to experiment with product manufacturing, which Amazon was new to. So it was a learning opportunity, right? So enough about Amazon, because Amazon is part of this Magnificent Seven, and they're a key part of it. And it's a company that will continue evolving. I will say one thing, which Jeff once said in an internal meeting that was then leaked externally, which is Amazon will one day go bankrupt. In spite of its success, in spite of its lineage, Amazon will one day go bankrupt. And the only opportunity that Amazonians have is to continue staving off that development. Every day should be day one. Every day within the organization should be as if it's the first day that you're starting the business. What kind of enthusiasm do you bring to the day? What kind of critical thinking is there? What kind of willingness to work as hard as possible to deliver results is there, the hunger? Versus day two, which is about apathy, accepting things for what they are, not challenging the status quo, basically just checking in to check out, right? So that's the opportunity on the table. Quick run through of product managers. This is actually a 4-hour workshop that I present around how to build a product management team. At Amazon specifically, project management does not exist. Everything is around product management, and you'll hear different versions of the truth today around, how to manage your business and its products, but this is the Amazon way of looking at things, right? So the product manager is the voice of the customer. Every Amazonian is hired to be the voice of the customer, but the product manager has a very special role to play because he or she needs to articulate the needs of the customer and ensure that the strategy being set by the organization actually reflects that sentiment. And the best product managers are the ones that are able to say, we need to stop doing something, right? This is no longer in need for the customer. It's no longer profitable. These are big judgment calls that have to be made. So they have to be done in a context where you understand how it'll impact the customer and also how it'll impact the business, right? And we have this sort of collage of qualities that one's looking for. But the two that I want to highlight is, first of all, customer vision and need, right? So oftentimes in business, we get caught in our own echo chamber. We want to be right versus doing what is right for the customer. So it's not what it should be, which is what's right for the customer. It's who's right in the room. Who do we align ourselves to politically that makes the most sense? Fortunately, at Amazon, that's a culture that very much does not exist, right? It is about staying customer obsessed because customers, at the end of the day, keep the lights on. Not your manager, not the VP, not the CEO. And then people management and strategy. This is especially poignant given the hype curve we're currently experiencing with AI and how it's going to change everything. It's going to change a lot of things, but there are certain things that will remain the same. And so how do we find this augmented world where human skills, tech skills through AI can complement one another so that we do things that are efficient and effective and also remind ourselves of what it means to be human at the end of the day. A quick slide around where we are and where we're going. We can't predict the future, but we can definitely look backwards and ask ourselves how far have we come, and then get a rough idea of the trajectory that we're on. The world economy is going to double over the next 25 years, which is a staggering thought. So depending on who you ask, year to date, we're probably a $100 trillion world economy. That's the global market opportunity that exists for all the ideas in the world, right? By 2050, we'll have about $227 trillion worth of opportunities to chase. So somewhere over the next 25 years, there's going to be another world economy created, another $100 trillion. I mean, these are staggering numbers to think about. You know, $1 billion idea becomes a drop in the ocean in a $227 trillion economy, right? So if we think big around what the possibilities are, right, the opportunities for ourselves in this global economy, I think it's really important to, you know, to use an American term, to blow the ceiling off and think really big, especially in the context of Europe, where we have these challenges with innovation, stagnation, population decline. These are all real challenges that we need to find ways and means to address. And as you see from this list, the world economy, in terms of who has the majority of the share of it, is also going to change. So we have this current disposition where half of the world economy is from the top 5 countries. So we have 5 countries that dominate the world economy. And there's a shift that's happening because of technology, because of innovation, different demographics that are coming to the front. The US still has the lion's share, but there's an opportunity to start reshaping our economies in order to benefit from these changes. I mentioned sustainability right at the beginning of this presentation, and I think it's important that we just touch on that for a moment. So in this relentless pace to grow and be number one, it's going to be very important to ensure that we do it in an inclusive manner. From an environmental point of view, the impact that we have on society, or the environment at least, but also the people on this planet and the economies that we can grow together. I don't know if any of you listened to any of the COP29 presentations, but there's a very small island nation called Tuvalu. It's the world's smallest economy. They generate about $60 million a year in GDP. And they're actually at risk of disappearing as a nation because of rising sea levels. So they've had to upload their culture, their mannerisms, their physical identity into the metaverse in order to retain some of their sovereignty. So, you know, there's a risk that by 2040, 60% of their island will be flooded. So these are some of the implications that one really has to think about: how weather pattern shifts, consumerism, technology and innovation should be done in such a way that it's inclusive, right? Just an important thing to remember as part of this growth curve that we're on. Just to summarize, in terms of what we've discussed today, and I appreciate today has been a rapid run through and what it takes to be part of the Magnificent Seven. When you're building out your teams, and I appreciate this $227 trillion opportunity can be overwhelming. So thinking big, but then starting very, very small. What is the smallest thing that you can do to start initiating change in yourself, in your team, your business? And I think it really comes down to building the right mindset and culture. So finding what works for you and your team, right? And codifying in a way that others can compare notes to say we're on the right track or we're not. And it's not just about one person having the right culture and attitude. It should be more than the sum of its parts analogy. Next up is looking at enabling people, right? The last thing you want to do is hire very talented people and then frustrate them by not giving them the right resources, right? Resources in the form of training, resources in the form of access to information, etc. Even today is an example of professional development, right? Coming together today, learning from others. You know, thankfully you work for organizations that see the light, but it's also the people that are not in this room that we should try and see how we can inspire them. Becoming data-driven. The classic, if you can't measure it, you can't monitor it, you can't manage it. So whether that's your revenue, your carbon emissions, your progress reports, you know, it's great to have anecdotes to say that you have a feeling about something and that people are saying X, Y, and Z, but to codify that into a way where there's actually data that substantiates your thinking, because that way you can track how you're moving towards completion. And then choosing the right project. This is phenomenally difficult because in most organizations, there are plenty of challenges to address, you know, tens, if not hundreds. So how do you take that one project that you can really sink your teeth into, apply these lessons to, and give people the conviction and the security to see that these new ways of working are delivering results, right? And then looking at scaling. So whatever you're doing, think about how can you scale it. So if Google has this philosophy of, let's find one customer that we can find similarity in with 1 million other customers, and then let's access 10 million customers, right? So if everyone uses email, that's something we all share and hate, hopefully. Let's find 10 million people that need access to email, 100 million or 1 billion, scale it from there. And I think with all of these changes that you're looking to introduce, I love this image. It's from Atomic Habits. A little and often gets you there in the end. If you small changes, small incremental changes compounded can have profound positive influences. Similarly, if you allow bad behavior in an organization, right, slowly but surely it'll start eroding your culture of innovation, the respect that people have for one another, the veracity at which you're able to make decisions. There's a great book I recently read called How to Start a Revolution. It's banned in certain countries for obvious reasons. But it talks about the fact that you only need 4% of a population to start a revolution, right? That's a very small percentage. And in organizations, it's the same, positive or negative. A very small percentage of people can have a dramatically, exponentially difficult change on an organization. So it's important to ensure that you just strike that balance. That brings me to the end of my presentation. I'm here this afternoon as well, happy to answer any questions that you may have. Feel free to, ask around Amazon or some of the other companies that were mentioned today. And most importantly, enjoy the learning from today as well, right? Thank you.
Thank you.